Let's get back to Auburn as a basketball team. I mentioned 18-1 overall, 6-0 in the SEC. They have 11 quadrant one victories. And this is why I said earlier, it's possible they were playing those final 2 minutes for their number one ranking, but not definite, because I'm not sure they are anymore. Mm-hmm. My point being this, are they so far ahead of the pack right now in terms of resume that they could actually lose a game, a quality game, and still be number one in the top 25 and number one in the AP poll? Let me put it to you this way. Then you answer that question. 11 quadrant one wins right now. That is 3 more than anybody else in the country. All right. They have 3 more quadrant one wins than anybody else in the country. Oregon is second with 8. All right. Nobody else has more than 6. So Auburn has 3 more quadrant one wins than anybody else in the country and 5 more than everybody else in the country except Oregon. That's where we're at. Even if Auburn, because this week they got at LSU and at Ole Miss, that's tough. 2 road games. Even if they were to lose one of those games, let's say they lose at LSU on Wednesday, right? They would still have a resume that's better than anybody else's in the country. Now, I know Duke has strong computer numbers and Duke owns a win over Auburn, and these things matter. But if Auburn loses on Wednesday at LSU, because this will be something I've got to deal with on Thursday morning. If Auburn loses Wednesday at LSU, I'll have to wake up on Thursday morning. More likely, I'll do it at 3 o'clock in the morning after I get out of studio. But either way, it'll have to get done. And I've got to make a decision. What do I do now? Because traditionally, you're number one and you lose, and people just wake up the next day and they expect for you to not to be number one anymore, right? I don't necessarily subscribe to that way of thinking. Think of this as golf. If you've got a 5-shot lead going into 18 and you double bogey 18, you still win the tournament, right? I think Auburn's got like a pretty comfortable lead going into, and we're not going to 18, but you get the golf analogy.
Yes.
They're at the top of the leaderboard, and there's a gap between them and everybody else right now. So what I'm about to tell you is true based on current numbers. If Auburn were to lose at LSU on Wednesday, they'd be 11-2 in quadrant one. Mm-hmm. They'd be 18-2 overall and 11-2 in quadrant one. Duke, who is the team that's sitting there ready to replace them, would be 17-2 overall, but still only 5-2 in quadrant one. Auburn would still, with a loss, be 11-2 in quadrant one. Duke would be 5-2 in quadrant one. I think Jerry Palm would agree with me. You would wake up on Thursday and Auburn would still be the projected number one overall seed in the NCAA tournament. And that's why I think you could make an argument that we have reached a place where Auburn can take a sensible loss, like a loss in quadrant one, and still wake up the next day and be considered the number one overall seed in the NCAA tournament. And for my purposes, perhaps the number one team in the top 25 and 1. What do you make of what I just said?
I agree with that entirely. And I agree with that specifically because the top 25 and 1 is a season-long ranking that mostly correlates right with bracketology, right? Like you look at Jerry Palm's bracket, you have Auburn at number 1. He has Auburn as the number 1 overall seed. I do tend to think that AP voters, and I do a tomorrow's top 25 and 1, or tomorrow's top 25 today, every Sunday, kind of projecting how AP voters will vote on Monday. And
by the way, let me stop you for a second.
Yes.
That's a great idea. I don't know if you came up with it or one of our bosses came up with it, but like I've seen it gets good numbers. People are looking for that type of thing. That was honestly the idea behind the very first me doing rankings. I really used to only do them on Sunday nights. And it was the exact same idea. Here's what I think the AP polls should look like tomorrow. I'll give you one extra team. That's the top 25 and 1. That was the original idea behind it. Then it was like, you want to do it every day? And so here we are. But getting back to that, it's just a new it's a different version of something we used to do coming from a different voice. And it doesn't have to match me. You and I are different people. This stuff is all subjective, but it's I like that you do that, and I gather it's doing well.
Appreciate it. Yeah. And it's fun because I get to see kind of the trends with how AP voters react on a week-to-week basis. And given that, I actually think Auburn would have dropped had they lost this weekend. I actually think Duke would have supplanted Auburn as the number 1 team in the AP poll on Monday. Not necessarily thinking that I would agree with that. In fact, I'm more in line with you. I think you look at just overall resume. Auburn, they have more quad 1 wins. They have a better resume overall. Duke is still very high up there and projected number 1 seed. All of that. But Auburn, I think in terms of what it has done to this point in the season, there's no question the number 1 overall seed. So yeah, I'd like to kind of to your point, I think, they could take a reasonable loss right now. Auburn could, and still remain number 1 in your top 25 and 1. Would totally agree with that assessment. AP voters, I think, I've found are a little bit more reactionary, and I wouldn't be surprised if Auburn took a loss at some point. Duke keeps winning. They have the longest win streak in college basketball. Duke could end up moving up to number 1. I think that's possible.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is true. If Duke were to win this, if Duke is still sitting here as a 2-loss team next Monday and Auburn loses a game this week, I do think AP voters would then move Duke to number 1. I'm not sure it would be right.
Yeah,
but I'm sure I think they'd probably do it. And I never want to, there's like 60 something AP voters. So when you start talking about the stupid AP poll and dumb AP voters, like you're roping in a lot of people who don't deserve it. So let me be clear. Not all AP voters are lazy. Not all of them are reactionary. Not all of them are incapable of doing the work, or at least uninterested in doing the work. But some of them clearly are every week. It's why I started writing the poll text column. So the lazy thing to do, without really thinking about it, the way you and I are talking through it, is to just be like, well, number 1 lost and number 2 won, so number 2 is now number 1, right? That is probably what they will do, because there's enough people like that who contribute to that poll. I'm not certain it would be right. I don't think it would be right. I think there's a scenario where Auburn could still lose a game and still have clearly the best resume in the country. And if you are trying to rank based off of resumes, which is largely what I try to do with the top 25 and 1, then you've got an easy case to make to just keep Auburn there even after a loss. I'll deal with that if I have to deal with that middle of the week. For now, one of the things I read somewhere, maybe like Instagram meme or something, like 90% of the stuff, 95% of the stuff you think about and worry about never really actually happens. So it's just a lot of waste. That's exactly what this could be. Maybe Auburn never loses again. You never have to have the conversation. But if they lose, I'll figure it out, just like I always do. With Tennessee, just 3-3 in their past 6 games. I still have them 6 in the top 25 and 1. The resume is still super strong, let's not lose focus of they were up 4 in the final 2 minutes against the number 1 team in the country on the road. Like, I'm not going to punish a team for that. If you're ranked 6 in the country and you go play number 1 to a 1-possession game, like, I think you should still be 6 in the country. So I left Tennessee where they were, but just 3-3 in the past 6 games. Up next for them, they've got Kentucky coming to Knoxville on Tuesday.